Hi, I'm Joe Polizzi, and this is the Content Inc. podcast. 5 minutes every Monday for content creators who desire to be content entrepreneurs. Hi, everyone. I'm very excited to release our fourth Content Inc. book tour interview. This means that for the next 8 weeks after this one, I'll be dropping a special Content Inc. episode on Thursday mornings. Today's episode features Nathaniel Whittemore, better known as NLW, who hosts one of the most popular crypto and macro finance podcasts in the world called The Breakdown. So here's the interview, lightly edited, and you'll hear Ann Ginn from The Tilt chime in during the middle of the podcast, and then I'll close it out at the end. Enjoy. Nathaniel, how you doing?
Good. How are you?
Good. Hey, thanks for being here. Really appreciate it. So we're going to get started here. So if everyone would go ahead and tweet this out to your friends or hit the plus button, we'll get as many people as we can. My name is Joe Polizzi. I'm the founder of The Tilt, a newsletter for content creators, and author of Content Inc., the business model for content creators. And today's session is part of the Content Inc. tour, and I'm so excited to have Nathaniel Whittemore, better known as NLW Online, as our key guest today. NLW is a case study in the Content Inc. book, and we're just going to talk to him today about his podcast, The Breakdown. And NLW, I was talking before you arrived, it's one of my favorite podcasts. And I think I've listened to every episode since maybe March of last year. It's been a long time, so we could talk a little bit about that. But I'd also like to welcome Ann Ginn and Laura Kozak from The Tilt. They'll be assisting me with the Q&A. And also thanks to Ed Nussbaum for adding the Content Inc. book tour on the Startup Club for Clubhouse. So again, we're going to go NLW. We're going to do about 30 minutes, you and I. And of course, this will be on our podcast later as well. And then we're going to open up for Q&A as we go. So anybody that wants to ask questions, you can just hit the hand signal at the bottom right-hand side, and Ann will get you up on stage. So
Sounds great.
Let's get started. NLW, Nathaniel Whittemore, is an independent strategy and communications consultant for leading crypto companies, as well as the host of The Breakdown, which is why he's here. One of the fastest growing, maybe the fastest growing podcast. Is that right? Is it the fastest growing podcast in crypto?
I don't know if it's the fastest growing anymore because there's a lot of new ones. It's certainly gotten big. Let's just put it that way.
Well, crypto media has blown up, and then you've blown up as well. So it's been really good timing. So yeah, I don't know when I got started and got hooked on yours, but it was from going to CoinDesk, I remember. So I went to CoinDesk. I was trolling around looking for some Bitcoin articles, and I found your podcast, and I've been listening to, your either 10 to 12 minutes or, every once in a while you'll throw in a 45-minute interview with somebody. So I've been really enjoying it. So what I would like to start with, Nathaniel, is I know so many things we could start talking about, but I'd love to get your origin story behind the Breakdown podcast. So if you would, give us the 3-minute origin story of how you got to that, the point of starting it. I know you've traveled a lot, you've lived a lot of different places. Why did you start it? How did you start it? And take us up to today.
Sure. I mean, I think that so I've always used content as a way to kind of cut the line in anything that I've been doing. So, I started my professional life focused on social impact stuff, and it was kind of an extension of what I had been doing in college. I went to school at Northwestern, and I was designing programs for students to go abroad and learn how to actually make a difference, and kind of turn that into a full program design center at the school. And in that process, used content to build a reputation, get access to more resources, get access to more people. I ended up meeting a guy who was founding a company that was a tiny little thing, or just a couple people at that point, called change.org, which ended up pulling me out to San Francisco. And then we used content at change.org to build the first couple million users of that platform, which is now the largest online petition site in the world, 10 or 15 years later, or whatever it is. Then doing different stuff in Silicon Valley for a decade, always used content as a way to kind of, bring in more people and so on and so forth. And so I shifted my focus almost entirely to crypto in 2017, and had kind of, always knowing that I had this pattern of content. I think for me, the thing about content was that the way that it worked is when, um, I always had kind of the knowledge of what it could do in terms of creating and opening up access to new opportunities. But the only time it ever works is, or at least for me, was when I was also kind of exploring things out loud, rather than just kind of trying to have a point of view. So the first content that I actually did in crypto in a big way was a thing that was, I mean, it's morphed into kind of four different versions, I think, at this point. But I started doing a thing called Long Read Sunday right when Twitter had released the thread feature for everyone, and people weren't really doing threads yet at that time, other than a few here and there, or at least they had just started. And a lot of the great, this is kind of like 2018ish, early 2018ish. A lot of the great content that was being created around crypto thinking and Bitcoin thinking was in these threads that would evaporate. And so I started this Sunday newsletter that was via thread on Twitter, that kind of curated the most interesting threads and spun a narrative arc up around them, and that kind of built a Twitter following, and eventually that morphed into a newsletter version because Twitter started super de-emphasizing and kind of punishing the type of threads that I'd been doing. Plus, people got kind of less interested in sharing them because they'd had that happen before. So anyways, the long story short, content evolves really quickly. And I had been interested in different kind of mediums for a while and doing something more long form. And so actually the origins of the breakdown were originally it was a live stream called Crypto Daily 3 at 3. And it was basically what the brief is now, if you've ever listened to the show, which is the first kind of short segment. But it's basically 3 topics for 3 minutes each. I did it live. I had articles kind of up next to me, so you could see that as I was streaming. And I dabbled with that. And basically what I found is that people were confused about whether it was a live stream, whether it was supposed to be a podcast, whether it was supposed to be a video on demand on YouTube. And so I decided that the podcast format had the best, it was closest to what I actually wanted the thing to be and where I wanted to take it. And I kind of planned to reboot the thing specifically as a podcast. And CoinDesk was a marketing client at the time. They had just brought on someone whose mandate was to build out podcasting. And so I decided to launch it with them and kind of leverage their audience to give it a big jumpstart. And so that brings us up to, I guess, when we officially launched. January 2020 was the first full month of the breakdown.
I thought it was on longer than that because I started pretty soon right after. I think right about pandemic time when I had a lot of free time. I was I was like, okay, I'm going to listen to this one as you go. So let's talk real quick because a lot of the podcasters that I've interviewed, they do not have partnerships with an outside media company, and you do. And I think you'd probably say that there's some benefits to that. Can you talk about how that partnership works at all with CoinDesk? Which those people that don't know, CoinDesk is a fairly large media company in the crypto space.
Yeah, CoinDesk is the biggest media company if you go by page views. They've got about 44 million page views last month. I think Cointelegraph was next at like 16. So they're the big player in that space. So for me, I like ways to kind of move more quickly than I otherwise would. And anytime you're creating content, the question is distribution, right? It doesn't matter, strictly speaking, how good it is, or I mean, it does, but you really need distribution, or you need to think about distribution as well, right? You can't just assume that even if your content's going to be really good, it's going to grow. There's also an objective, like every hour that I was spending on the breakdown was an hour that I wasn't spending building out a consulting business, and so from a financial standpoint, there's a prerogative to also think about how to short circuit the kind of growth phase as well. And the kind of the additional piece of this for me is that I had a relationship with this company. I'd known them. I knew who they were. They were still building. And so it gave me kind of a unique moment to negotiate on my terms what I wanted for, right? I don't think it's a relationship that a lot of other companies would follow the model of, because I have complete editorial independence and I wouldn't compromise on that. I own all of the content. It's all my IP, and that's another thing that I wouldn't compromise on. That's not really the way most kind of podcast networks are built. I don't know what CoinDesk has done for other podcasts that they've launched subsequently. I'm kind of not privy to that side of their business. But my impression is that it's a pretty unique relationship relative to even them too. So, for me, it was about how can I will say, I guess, and we can dig into more details, based on this audience's interest. But for me, the distribution was what mattered much more than anything else. The production is great. The production team has been awesome. But that's something that really, like, when it came down to why I wanted to do that, it was getting access to a flow of new users in the form of people who hit their homepage. And it sounds like Joe, you're one of them.
No, well, I want to break that down a little bit, especially with your goals, and then get into some of the tech aspects. But just want to do a quick room reset. Hey, everybody, we got a lot of new people. We're talking to NLW about how he built his amazing crypto podcast, The Breakdown. We're going to get to questions in about 20 minutes. So if you have questions, that would be great. And if you want to invite some friends to this through Twitter, please do. Talk about your goals, NLW, because I know you've got the content consultancy that you do. You work with a lot of companies in the crypto space. Was this created for that, or let's look at it now because of the success of The Breakdown? And I'm under. You don't have to share the specifics, but I'm assuming you get some cut of the revenue from the advertisers, the sponsors on your podcast that CoinDesk brings to the table. Can you talk about that a little bit? Or is it the same thing? Has it changed? Are you thinking differently about building this out to something more?
Yeah. So it wasn't. So I think that it would be wrong to say that it's like initially it was strictly focused on being content marketing for my consulting business. You know what I mean? That's a part of it, but that's kind of overly reductive, I would say.
Okay.
However, there's an obvious kind of everyone who does consulting knows that the best clients are the one that come inbound and know they already want you and are familiar with your work versus those you have to go out and pitch in some way, right? And so if I'm trying to make an argument to people that I'm good at helping them, tell their story and understand where they fit in the crypto narrative, a podcast that shows what the crypto narrative is every day is a really valuable asset. So that's kind of where it started. However, I tend to not do things without the ambition to do them absolutely all the way and as big as I can. And the podcast I had big ambitions for right away. And I'm kind of getting to where you're going. Like, the podcast now does make significantly more than all the other contracts that I do put together. I keep those business lines running simultaneously, but it's much more lucrative than the consulting business, just by nature of how much it's grown.
All right, so I do want to talk about your tech you're using, why you made certain choices, but
Sure.
I want to go straight to the bottom. What's next now? So the podcast has made this possible for you. Are you thinking about growing this out to a larger media enterprise? I mean, there's a lot of opportunities. You've talked about a lot of things that are opportunities in the crypto space. Are you looking at some of those now?
I'm really not, to be honest. I think it's a weird answer, but I have a tendency to bounce back between and forth between my sort of entrepreneurial side that wants to build things, which involves being a lot of heads down and kind of behind the scenes and operational, versus like the pure play content production. And I've stumbled onto this thing that is extremely valuable, or it seems to be extremely valuable to people and is lucrative to me, that is pretty close to pure play content production. And I've fought the urge many times to go out and try to turn it into some sort of media company. And there will be extensions of it. There's other ideas that I have, but I actually have kind of a boring answer of of not being overly focused on kind of adding a bunch of new shows and creating a whole big media network and things. Like, I kind of just want to keep doing the breakdown as good as it can be and evolve the show to what it wants to be.
Well, you have a newborn at home, right? It's 2 months now.
Well, we have an 8-week-old and we have a 2.5-year-old.
Okay,
so,
very good.
Yeah, we got the double. Yeah, it's there's a lot of there's a lot of reasons to also kind of like be in that keep doing what works without
Exactly. No, no,
you know.
that makes perfect sense. I'd love, so there's a lot of people here, they want to know how you built this podcast, and I always like to talk about the technical side as well because I think it's important. You have a daily podcast. It's much different than and I have two weekly podcasts and I know the production that goes into those. Can you talk about the daily side, what you do? Yours is different as well. You've got a differentiation area because you're mostly a monologue show and you have an interview maybe once a week, sometimes twice a week. So can you talk about what goes into building, how much time it takes, kind of break down your day?
Yeah, sure. So the I think I guess an important thing to note, and again, we can go into this more too, to the extent that we're looking at like things that I've learned, I didn't set out to have a like so the differentiation that I set out to achieve when I started was around the idea of a daily, right? It blew me away that there wasn't daily commentary in this space, which was so fast moving when there's a million different types of daily commentary in kind of traditional financial media. So I did set out to kind of be differentiate on that. I wasn't sure when I started how much I was going to be able to get away with basically the daily audio op-ed format versus guests. And I aired a lot more on guests at the beginning. Also, guests are classic growth hack for this type of podcast. I mean, everyone does like, the get big guests and they leverage their audience and so on, sort of thing. However, I have found that there is a lot more appetite for just the kind of individual op-ed shows as opposed to the interview shows than I would have imagined, which has been very gratifying because I kind of prefer that format in general. So anyways, that's just a little bit behind the scenes in terms of the content itself. From a production standpoint, I mean, it's not particularly complicated. I wake up in the morning. I'll sometimes know the night before what I'm going to talk about the next day, depending on when what came out on the news cycle. I usually, the more that I can make things contextual to an actual piece of news that has come up, the more I like it, right? That's obviously kind of like the benefit of doing a daily. So oftentimes, if there isn't a clear winner in terms of news from the night before or just from the day before, I'm thinking about what kind of larger, more narrative story I'm thinking about. But I almost never actually prepare the thing the day before. Then kind of the morning hits, I spend kind of somewhere between an hour and 2 hours prepping the show. It's 20 to 30 minutes to record, and then it goes off to CoinDesk, where there's an editor who preps everything, who kind of edits the show and then preps it for publication on the site too. It gets published to CoinDesk's feed at 3 p.m. and then it gets published to my feed at 9 p.m. So that's part of our arrangement. It's like I said, I wanted to own the IP. I wasn't willing to have it be exclusively on their feed under the CoinDesk podcast network. And so, but part of what I agreed to is obviously they want to have kind of the primacy there, so they get to release it 6 hours before I do. So that's the flow. I'm happy to get into more details, but that's the basics of it.
No, by the way, I can't stand that. I because I get your feed on the podcast, and I was like, because I see it come out on CoinDesk, and I'm like, I don't want to listen. I want to listen to it on your feed anyways. I just don't like it. So I wait.
I know. It's suboptimal, but it is. There's a lot of things that are suboptimal, like for the overall benefit,
Yeah,
But
I
like,
get it.
I know some folks that subscribe both just to like, I don't know. They like. I also know people that like. I don't know. It's just it is what it is. I'm happy when people subscribe either way.
So I want to. So you have the podcast. You've built out a couple channels that I know of, and maybe I don't know all of them, but I know you are very active on Twitter. You've got a great following, very much engaged on Twitter, and then you also publish to YouTube, I believe, and you ask for commentary at the end of all of your podcasts as well. Is that it? Does that work for you? Why did you make those decisions? Kind of go through that process.
I'm radically under indexed on this. I should be hiring people to run these channels way more. I have I have a Twitter profile for the podcast that barely ever gets used, just because it's there's just how many things you can do, and it's part of the trade off of running a consulting business at the same time. The YouTube has been for sure the most unexpectedly valuable channel. Twitter is okay. Twitter is actually not as valuable, I don't think, as people would think when it comes to content promotion. Twitter does not prioritize posts that are promoting content. Sharing links is not a thing that Twitter particularly likes. The most valuable, on average, you're going to do better with a tweet that's a picture, that's a meme, than you are sharing a link to a CoinDesk article or something. It takes a lot of work to get around that. So I do think Twitter is important because Twitter is where the crypto conversation lives. You can't really not be there in this particular industry, but it's not a particularly great channel for promoting this. But I would say that I don't have good. My best advice on how to promote your content via other social channels would be to not follow my lead and actually do it more intentionally than I have.
Well, don't you think there's been an opportunity for you because you've been focused? You just said, okay, I'm not going to be on every channel. I'm just going to say I'm going to do Twitter and YouTube, and that's it.
Yes, I think that I definitely think that focus matters. I think that you're going to do better. This is totally arbitrary, but having 40,000 followers on one channel is probably better than having 10,000 on four channels, in general. Maybe that's not true. I don't really know. I guess it depends on the types of content. But certainly, like I said, YouTube is by a mile the most valuable.
Yeah, can you break that down a little bit? Because I've been kicking around whether or not to use YouTube with our podcast. I've decided not to because I felt that you had to have videos or whatever. I just didn't want to use it as pure distribution. But so how has it helped you? What are you doing differently there that's working for you?
The biggest thing that I think the biggest thing that conventional wisdom has wrong about YouTube is that people are not willing to consume. All of the podcast hosts these days, or many of them, have the option to automatically push to YouTube. And if you have the right image, it will just turn your podcast into a video that has that static image for the whole thing. Now, every YouTube tutorial, every content recommendation will say you can't do that. It indexes low. People don't want that. They want video. And yes, absolutely, people would prefer video on YouTube. It's a visual medium. However, I have found an enormous number of people consume content in the same way that people listen to music. YouTube is one of the biggest primary music channels. It is a huge channel for podcasts, including ones that don't have video. And frankly, if you look at my engagement numbers relative to many similar types of YouTube channels, just the stupid, most basic version is kind of kicking the crap out of a lot of other things out there. And I don't have, like I said, this was something I completely stumbled onto. It's not some brilliant insight, but my takeaway is that there is a much larger audience of people who, I don't know if they just leave YouTube up on a window next to their computer while they're working, if they've got a couple of screens or what it is, but it is a big channel for the show with very little effort put into it other than just pushing to it.
So you're just distributing the feed, syndicating the feed, and that's
just
it.
Syndicating the feed to it.
Now you ask at the end of your podcast for comments on YouTube, for feedback. Are you getting it? Is it working?
Yeah, the comments, the YouTube is the most active comment channel by a mile, and a lot of it's actually pretty meaningful and interesting, and not just chaos. Although there is chaos there too.
It's always chaos.
It's really surprising though. Actually, I don't know if it's the nature of content, and the only types of people that are interested in my content are the types that actually want to have substantive conversations. But it's again has kind of blown away my presumptions or kind of previous, my priors basically about YouTube and what it could do.
Okay. I know Anne has a question in a little bit, but I'm going to throw it over to her and anybody else who has any questions. But let's talk about some key insights. When did you know? So you've been doing this for almost a year and a half now. When did you know you had something? Go through some aha moments. What happened? What really hit you hard here?
I don't know if that's the kind of the way that I thought about it. Almost immediately the feedback was good, but I had done kind of a test run, I was pretty sure that there was a market for it. I feel like I've had various times where it's gotten clearer and clearer to me that this format is something different that people really like. But I don't know if there was a single kind of aha moment per se. I will say that it was not a toil. The numbers started going up very quickly, and again, part of that was I chose this channel. Another part of it was that I had a big, a decent sized Twitter following to help launch it into, right. So it was not a standing start, and that makes a big difference. But I certainly think, I guess, to try to not gloss over your question, to the extent there was a moment like that, it was just seeing how much appetite there was for the discussion of macroeconomics in the broader crypto conversation. And, my podcast was really like pushing that super hard, March, April, May of last year. And it has obviously become, Lynn Alden was on my podcast before she was on any other crypto podcast. And obviously now she's a mainstay across the board. Same with Luke Groman, same with a huge number of people. And I think that's just because that's what I'm interested in. I call it a podcast about power and big picture power shifts that, happens to spend a lot of time on Bitcoin and crypto because I think that they're a necessary part of that conversation. And I think that it's gotten clearer that those conversations are connected over the last year. So I think that's part of it.
Got it. I got one more question before I send it over to Anne, because I know she has a couple questions, but so it's a little different. You have the monologue setup is wonderful, but also it's tough at the same time because you bring guests on a show as influencers, and generally you get more people listening to it because they're fans of that influencer. You don't have that as much. I mean, obviously you get the ones you mentioned, you get on every, once a week or something like that, but you're mostly monologue. And it seems like that partnership with CoinDesk made all the difference. So my question is to people listening, do you recommend that partnership? I know you talked about distribution. Like, if you went into that, somebody goes into that, is that something if a person has a monologue podcast that they should pursue, looking at a major media company, becoming the talent? And if you did that again, would you do something different?
So I guess I don't. The short answer is I don't know, because I don't know of any other, like, monologue podcasts are not a normal thing.
No.
I mean, anywhere, it's a weird thing. Like I said, I've been very gratified to see that people like it, but it's basically a daily op-ed. And even shows that are more like, about the host, there's usually a couple hosts, right? It's a conversation. So it's hard to give too much general advice from that. I guess what I would say about the partnership thing, which is maybe even disconnected, like, listen, I did the get guests that help you kind of, increase the audience thing at the beginning too. So think about it this way. I was doing as many guest posts on average in March, April, May of last year as any of the other podcasts. It's just that I filled the other 4 days with monologue podcasts too, so it wasn't like I was not doing that. So I think that we can maybe explore the question of like the partnership or not, just on its own terms. And I guess what I would say on that front is, for me, a lot, like, I was able to negotiate a partnership that preserved a huge amount of control. And for me, creative control, editorial control was sort of a non-starter. And I was willing to trade, a big percentage of the revenue, for that in terms of the ad split. I was willing to trade the suboptimalness of having, to this 2 feed thing or whatever, which among other things is like, it's terrible for figuring out like how your show ranks compared to others, because it's split across 2 feeds, so you can't really tell on Chartable or anything. But those are like, those for me were like very easy to make trades in the service of the larger thing that I wanted, which is I wanted a show whose voice I had total control over, with the big audience and with a channel to keep growing the audience. So it was a great fit for me, but I don't think it is a pretty unique set of circumstances. And I feel all of these partnerships are always going to be unique. So I'll give you just one counterpoint. My wife has been growing a true crime podcast, and we've been pretty avowedly like, it's very difficult to do that as an independent. If you look at the top 200 on Apple, there's a tiny handful, no more than 10% are independent in any way. in any meaningful way, and it's a very difficult path, but that's the path that we've gone because, if we went and tried to negotiate with Wondery, even if, or someone like that, even if they were interested, they're not cutting deals where you retain a lot of control, and most podcast companies aren't, at least at this stage. So,
Well,
sorry, go ahead.
no, I was going to say what you've done with the partnership is brilliant because most of the case studies in the Content Inc. book for podcasters, they're very rare that they started out with a podcast. Most of them started out with another platform. They had a blogging platform, they were on YouTube, and then they built that platform and diversified into a podcast, which was immediately successful because they already had an audience.
Mm-hmm.
That's the difference. It's very hard, especially to get found. I mean, you know how bad podcast search is. It's not even
Yep.
a thing. So it's very hard to get found and break through the clutter unless you have an audience somewhere else. And that's why I thought that your move was absolutely brilliant. Getting a partner, it sounds like the terms worked well for you. So all is well. So
And I think, I mean, it's, to Coindesk, I think it probably only worked because, Coindesk and I had a relationship. We knew each other. We had a lot of confidence going into it. So,
good.
it's a kind of a unique situation. I guess I will say though that like, it's always dangerous to assume too much about like what people in companies will and won't be willing to do in the context of like podcasting is still so new. You know what I mean? Like if I was starting right now and I didn't have a clear an easy connection to someone like a CoinDesk or whatever, right? I didn't have a media distribution channel. I would look at, is there a company where I can basically do like this as, the podcast that I want to do as a piece of content that the company funds, and maybe there's some agreement there because I can imagine negotiating a lot more. I don't know. There's just all these different opportunities, and I think it's probably good to be not too locked at this stage into any one model being the way, and at least go try things out because it's kind of it's a creator's market, I guess, in terms of just coming up with new ideas.
Well, lots of content creation. Distribution is king, though. So you got to do it. And I know you have a couple questions. You want to go ahead?
Yes, and I actually have one question before we get to my other question, which is, what's the name of your wife's true crime podcast?
It's called Love Murder. So it's all about like relationships gone very, very poorly.
That's an interesting adventure from that to come through. So before I ask my question, if anyone else has a question, please raise your hand. Just tap the hand in the lower right of your screen for that. So I'm curious, with podcasting, it's unique because it's a solo. You don't have that interaction like you would on a Clubhouse or other channels from that. So do you look at your audience as an audience or as a community, and kind of how do you relate to them? And I know you talked about some of the comments on YouTube, but I'm curious kind of your big approach or your overview approach to that.
I think that I actually tend to, it's very rare to me when people use the word community when they're actually talking about an audience, that it's legitimate. When it is, it's wonderful, but it's often not. And because community requires interaction with one another. So, like I'll give you an example of someone who has done this really well in the crypto space, Max and Stacy, Max Kaiser and Stacey Herbert, who have a million different things, content creation. They have their Orange Pill Telegram channel. There's 24,000 people that are screaming at each other all the time. That's a legitimate community, right? That get to interact with one another. I have an audience who, listen to me and I interact with them. And the place that it is a community, like kind of Twitter serves as the water cooler for the entire crypto space in a really meaningful way. That's where community happens. And so I have a lot of community style interactions that happen, but it's in Twitter and it's in the context of some specific content. So one thing that I do a lot is I will often ask people what they're most interested in hearing about, right? Because I'm genuinely stuck between a couple things, or I'm trying out even different titles. So like even today I said, what are you guys most interested in hearing about? Cyber attack shut down East Coast gasoline, CPI hitting 3%, 46 million Americans owning Bitcoin, according to a new survey, or something else. And, it's a super valuable thing there that has 13 questions and 700 people or 667 people voted in that. Like those are some community type things. But it's for me, it's kind of, I don't, there's no place that I have curated for them to come together. Now I did dabble with doing Discord, and I experimented with Discord because I like it a lot better for community than Telegram. Telegram is not an optimized community platform. It's so chaotic. It's so fast. You get more than a couple people in there, and it's just more content than anyone can handle. Whereas Discord, you can organize it into different rooms, different sections. And I love the Discord format. I found that maybe it would have worked. And I think that if I had really invested in it, it could have. I think it was just, there was a mismatch. And this was a long time ago. This was probably last summer. There's a mismatch between how much time I wanted to put into it to kind of really give it what it needed. And how there weren't initial community members who were kind of wanting to step up and be like the kind of champions to run it, which I think you need. So happy to go into that more, but that's kind of first thoughts or first reaction.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting thing talking about community champions and really taking the lead, because you see that work so well when you're limited in time from it. You talked about having, you should probably have some more help or whatever on to do some of the other channels. But I guess overall, how do you look at it from a business and building a team? Is it deliberate saying, this is where I want to be and with the resources available? Or are you thinking when you find the time that you can then look at adding to a team?
It's I feel apologetic. I have such bad answers, but I have had two things that have made this like a strange thing for me a little bit. One is the partnership, right, which creates a constant growth channel, which has minimized the need to overemphasize some of the kind of the organic growth channels. So that's one piece. The second piece is that it really has grown really, really fast. I mean, it rocketed. I mean, it grew 2,000% in the first year. It's going to, we're going to hit a new milestone this month that I'll announce at the end of the month in terms of the actual downloads. But it's just grown so fast that it's hard to focus on kind of carving out the time to do the sort of like the things that I really should do. I mean, the damn thing doesn't even have a website, it's so bad. But it's just that the content itself has really hit the nerve. And obviously there's other factors going into that. The third factor, which makes this advice or, kind of the context kind of useless for non-crypto podcasts, is that crypto has obviously had this inflection point moment over the last few months, and I anticipate that growth will continue, at least in some way until that is done. You look at it like all of the crypto podcasts are way up from where they were too, so it's not just me. So it's a kind of, it's an atypical, it's an atypical thing, in terms of the intentionality of where I want to drive it. Like I said, I'm trying for the first time to, at least for now, focus on being intentional about the type of content. I will say, so let me give you an example, rather than kind of having goals of, I guess I've kind of exceeded all the initial set of goals around reach and audience and things like that. So I'm kind of focused on content goals. And I find this sort of standard interview one-on-one format pretty boring now. And I think that there's so much crypto media that has the same people all the time that I'm not interested necessarily in just being another place where you have kind of I don't want to do just another Plan B interview where we talk about, the stock to flow model, as much as that would be popular. It's kind of it just seems like it's been done before. He said his piece before. I mean, some people kind of take themselves out of the podcast round. There's a bunch of people in crypto who don't do as many podcasts anymore because they feel like they've said everything for a little while, and they'll come back when they have more to say. But I'm thinking more, I guess, about the content and how I want to evolve that right now than I am about the business side of the podcast. And it's kind of a privileged position because of the weird combination of growth factors, partnership, and crypto bull market.
That makes sense. And the question and your answers are certainly not weird. It's just an interesting time and exciting growth, right? Good problems to have. Because
absolutely.
I totally understand. It's the shoemaker's kids not having all the marketing, right? When you're doing it, the marketing. So talk to me a little bit. You mentioned about how you pick a topic, look over what's happened kind of overnight to do your podcast. But I'm curious, and one of the things in working with the Tilt and my role is finding the topics and the news to write about. So I'm curious if you ever have plans, like in case you didn't have a topic of the day, or is it so much happening that you're never concerned if you have a topic to talk about or to connect with?
No, I definitely have. I have kind of a running list of kind of like broad narrative things that I'm always thinking about that feel like they need discussing at some point. So, for example, like right now, there's been a huge amount of like people love calling top signals in the crypto market right now. Everywhere they look, there's top signal. It's Paris Hilton getting in, top signal. This stupid dog coin's moving, top signal. And it's not so much that I think that they're wrong. It's just that I think that they're radically underestimating how much bigger the top has to run. So I think like that's a topic that if that I was planning on, that's sitting there for me sometime this week. If I don't have a clear news show, right? It's something that I've thought about. I have kind of the rough architecture for it in my head. It's a topic that I think is relevant and important. It's a topic that I think people would be interested in. But it's entirely possible that I will not get to it too, so, and it'll just kind of, the moment will pass or it'll be something else. So
social audio, especially as a podcaster, are you looking at Facebook? Are you looking at Twitter Spaces? We even thought about, one of our interviewees said, can we just do the whole book tour and put it on Twitter Spaces? And I'm like, we committed to Clubhouse a month ago when it was hot. Maybe we shouldn't have. What do you think about the whole thing?
So I think there's a couple of things. One is I think that the idea of it is really there's something clearly compelling here. Like I like the idea of people being able to have these conversations that can be more spontaneous, right? And that where different people who wouldn't normally talk to each other would. So I totally commend that as an attempt. I've just found in practice a couple things. One is you get a repeat of high school and college where it's just the loudest people who are willing to interrupt the most, who have the most airtime, which just makes people not willing to actually engage in any meaningful way. I feel like half the rooms that I end up in, or I have ended up, I've just totally abandoned the platform since I had kids, which I'll get to in a second, is the second problem with it. But I feel like every conversation that I used to have in here, I had to at some point, kind of put someone down for kind of going on their soliloquy or whatever. And it is completely the opposite of what the intention was. The second piece, though, that I think is really challenging is just it's not a platform for people with families. The synchronicity needed. Now, you guys, I think, are using it in a really smart way, doing the you're basically combining the best of all worlds, right? Where you're having the open drop-in audio conversation, combining it with, a podcast where it's like, whatever. If no one shows up, we have a great conversation. Who cares? We recorded a podcast at a medium where some people could come in. So that I don't think there's anything wrong with that. It's more just like, will it be some big disruptive medium? I'm super skeptical. Now, Twitter Spaces to me seems much more likely to do more of this because it is genuinely like it's easily integrated into the place that that everyone already lives, at least if you're in the crypto space. I don't know what the moderation is like. I haven't actually spent any time in there. Again, that's more on the just, the asynchronous is really, or synchronous is really difficult, with kids in a schedule and things like that. But I'm totally open to one of these things being a kind of a part of the landscape. But I saw a lot of people a couple months ago being like, this is the end of podcasting and podcasters are only going to do it live and in person and all this sort of stuff. And it's like, it clearly has not been the case. So I don't know. I don't know how it plays out. I know that I don't know. We'll just have to wait and see.
No, I agree. I think the jury's out with it. And, I've just been thinking, okay, well, Clubhouse is launching Android app. Maybe there's another thing there. I don't like the user numbers. I don't like how the engagement numbers went down. And then here's Twitter Spaces. There's all kind, and who knows what Facebook's going to do. I mean, we have no idea what that's going to be. But I think there is something there. but I'm with you. I don't like the high school mentality. Now, we've had 3 of these interviews that have gone fantastic because we had people asking smart questions, and then
Well,
you get people.
crypto's dangerous.
I have actively stayed away from anything crypto related on Clubhouse for that reason. I mean, I think the
it
first
is.
week I tried and it was okay,
Yeah.
and then you're like, okay, that's not going to work. So I got a couple more questions for you before we wrap
Yeah,
this up, Nathaniel. So I think you're downplaying the way you differentiated this a little bit because there's a lot of strategy. Because I was writing down as you're going, you really differentiated. You're talking macro, and you're not talking Bitcoin or stock to flow. You're really focused on macro. You've got a monologue style versus mostly the interview on most podcasts. You've got a daily show versus most of them that have maybe a couple times a week or a weekly, and you have a partnership. These are things that most podcasters don't do. I mean, this is very, very strategic. I mean, so did you think this way when you went into it and said, look, we can differentiate right off the bat, this could be successful if we do these 4 things?
So I think maybe to your point, I'm downplaying the intentionality of those things. Like they were all very intentional decisions. The daily was very clearly open territory for me. The partnership with CoinDesk, I knew was going to instantly create wider distribution and reach than a lot of other podcasts had, plus give credibility for guests that I wanted to have on, right? And that's a big thing too, especially because third leg of the stool, I knew that I wanted to do the podcast that I wanted to do. If I'm going to do a thing daily, it has to be what I'm interested in. And, to me, like what gets me interested in is these big power shifts. Like, just this a little bit in the crypto minutia, but people will often ask, like, why don't I talk about things besides Bitcoin? Because mostly there's not Bitcoin, it's mostly Bitcoin, certainly compared to everything else. DeFi and Ethereum have gotten in there a little bit more recently based on kind of their rising prominence in an institutional sphere. But the reason isn't that it is sort of an a priori dismissal of other things in the space, although for some things it'd be easy to. It's more like the conversation that I'm interested in is kind of shifts in economic power and what it means and social and cultural norms and all that sort of stuff. So that to me is less strategic, more it feels like, one, it's the thing that I wanted to talk about. And 2, it did feel to me to be an important part of the conversation that was, at least last year when I started in January, certainly under indexed relative to the space. I think it's caught up. Like, people get that you kind of have to engage with macro a little bit if you want to understand what's going on in Bitcoin and crypto. But so there was a lot of intention there. I mean, in terms of the monologue, that's been more evolving. Like, I hoped going into it that I could do that more because I felt like that was my strength. I mean, in a lot of ways, podcasting replaced essay writing for me, which is kind of the way that I had always done content before. I blogged a lot. I built blog networks at change.org. That was the medium. And this replaced that. And so is very comfortable for me. Like, I'm very opinionated as a person, and I like doing I like striking the balance of, if you listen to these shows, what I go for is, it's very rarely that I'm kind of like pulling up the soapbox and going on a rant. It's usually the way that I am trying to convince the listener of, or help them understand the way that I see the world, is through the architecture of the argument and kind of a comparatively subtle conclusion or introduction or whatever, right, versus just kind of like it's not exactly an op-ed, but it's kind of there. And so I thought that it was a pretty interesting approach, and have been very gratified to see that people respond to it, which is going back to some of your guys' other questions around where the intention has been for me recently, and to what extent it's on the business side of it and kind of perfecting that. It has in fact actually been more on the creative side now that I'm getting such good evidence and more feedback around the parts of the show that people like. It's more like figuring out, how I want to keep kind of evolving and iterating that side of it.
Yeah, I mean, so I'm a consumer of your podcast. I love the brief. I love your take. You always pick something that makes sense for me, whether it's 8 or 9 minutes on that. And then the long read Sunday. It just depends, right? If you get a Nick
totally.
If you get a Nick Carter piece in there, sometimes I just can't keep up. So
Long Read Sunday has been very surprising to me. I did not think it would be as popular as it was, to be honest. That's one that I thought was kind of cool, but I've had insane feedback on that, which is really, really interesting. So,
well, the other thing that we didn't talk about this, but you talk about narrative I bet you say the word narrative more in your
yeah, it's
podcast than
probably my
anything else.
most word.
No other crypto podcast focus on the narrative quite like you do. So that's a real differentiation point. So, all right. So we got a couple more minutes. I got two more questions before we close this thing out, NLW. So the second last one is, what's the worst advice you've heard for content entrepreneurs or podcasters in your space that you would just ward people away from?
Well, I went into a lot of the YouTube stuff, and I don't know how applicable that is to other areas, other topics on YouTube, but I would be, if I were in almost any industry, let's say I was doing like a real estate podcast, right? Um, totally different sphere, but still kind of in this like businessy type world. I would push to YouTube and see where I got, because that has been super surprising. It feels like a really interesting thing to explore more. So that's the most specific thing that I've seen is it not being enough to just push to a channel, and that you really have to double down on it. I would say I don't have conviction that would be the case in every space, but I've certainly seen enough of an impact that I would recommend going and exploring it. More generally, I would say that the like anytime you get too much into rules of content that get fixed, I feel like you're going to run into trouble because it's so evolutionary, and that does not mean that you have to chase every medium. Obviously, I've just kind of shared my thoughts on Clubhouse. So it doesn't mean like going and being everywhere all at once. Although, a guy that I used to work really closely with has 2.2 million followers here and was just named the social audio creator of the year by Adweek and has built a whole new thing around it, So like, who knows? Maybe sometimes doubling down on things is a really good approach. But I guess that for me, the biggest thing is like, there really aren't hard and fast rules in internet content, because everything ultimately is about the quality of the content, the audiences, and how they mesh up. And if you can find different ways to go about that and find, this is what I think about constantly now with the true crime podcast, is like, what are alternative paths to grow the audience, that we wouldn't have expected, and where do they fit and what's going to work and stuff. So, I think it's viewing things as open to experimentation, and trying to find avenues to and growth hacks and shortcuts and things like that aren't obvious, feels like the most important thing in some ways.
No, I mean, with what you just said, when we look at the case studies from the Content Inc. book, they focused on one platform like you're doing, and they really looked heavily on promotion. Really is as much as content creation. Mm-hmm. And that makes all the difference in the world. And I think that's one of the reasons why you're seeing all the success you are. So last question is, real quick, what's next? Like, I know you've got some plans. Is there something next on the horizon? You're going to hit this big number. You're going to announce it pretty soon. Are you doing something other than the podcast coming up pretty soon?
No, for now, it's just the podcast. I think where I would expand next from a content perspective is doing more in YouTube. I anticipate that over the course of this year, I will do more YouTube specific, YouTube first, YouTube only content, just because I think it feels like a very valuable channel to me. So that's kind of the biggest thing that I have. But honestly, right now is, like I said, this is a lot colored by also having the newborn and the toddler. But for a little while, it's kind of just making it through doing the daily is kind of as much as I can as I can do right now.
I totally understand and see what you're going to. So before I close this thing out, NLW, where's the best place people can get more information about you and the podcast?
The Twitter is the easiest. It's at NLW, and I'm pretty much at NLW on every other channel too. So that's where to find me.
That's the best. I mean, I don't even know how you got at NLW, but you did it. That's pretty amazing. So, okay, it's just Joe again. I hope you enjoyed this interview with NLW. Having a daily podcast is certainly a grind, And it was so interesting to hear how NLW creates a process that doesn't kill him and something that's feasible with his distribution partners. And again, NLW got it right. Marketing is critical for podcasts to work. Sometimes finding a distribution partner makes all the difference, as it did in NLW's case. Join us next Thursday on the Content Inc. podcast for another very special interview and case study from the Content Inc. book. Good luck, and go out and change the world for the better.